If they ever tell you to pay a fine before they tell you what you actually did, you're probably about to learn who really thinks they own your neighborhood. My name is Ethan Carter, and until that Tuesday afternoon, I believe the worst part of living in my subdivision was remembering which trash can went out on which day. I had lived there for almost 4 years, kept my front yard trimmed every Saturday morning, waved to neighbors during evening walks, and paid every HOA fee on time without giving it much thought. It was quiet, predictable, and exactly the kind of place I wanted after spending nearly a decade working long hours as a commercial electrician. That afternoon, I pulled my pickup into the driveway just after 5, grabbed my lunch cooler from the passenger seat, and noticed a bright yellow envelope taped directly to my front door. At first, I assumed it was another neighborhood newsletter or maybe an announcement about landscaping. Instead, the bold letters across the top read "Final Notice," followed by a demand for immediate payment of a $1,250 penalty. I stood there staring at the page, reading the same sentence 3 times because it made absolutely no sense. According to the notice, I had committed repeated violations that threatened community standards. There was no explanation beyond a vague reference to property appearance. I looked across my yard. The grass had been cut 3 days earlier. The flower beds were clean. My American flag was hanging exactly where it always had. My truck wasn't blocking the sidewalk. Nothing looked different than it had the day before. Before I could finish reading, I heard steady footsteps behind me. "Mr. Carter," a calm voice called out. I turned to see Linda Brooks walking up my driveway carrying a clipboard tucked neatly against her side. She was the HOA president, always perfectly dressed, always smiling just enough to seem polite without ever looking friendly. "I see you've received your notice," she said. "I'd appreciate it if you took care of the payment today so we don't have to move forward with additional action." I looked from her to the paper and back again. "What exactly am I paying for?" I asked. She gave me a practiced smile. "The violations are listed in our records. They're not listed here. You should already know them." That answer only made me more confused. "I don't know them because nobody has told me." Linda glanced toward the neighboring houses as if making sure people could see she was handling official business. "The board has documented several concerns. We don't debate completed decisions in driveways." "Then where do we discuss them?" I asked. "After the balance is resolved." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Pay first. Ask questions later. It sounded backwards. I looked at the notice again, searching for photographs, dates, addresses, anything specific, but there was nothing except legal-sounding language and a payment deadline 48 hours away. "I'm not writing a check for something I don't understand," I said evenly. Her smile disappeared for the first time. "That would be your choice, Mr. Carter, but choices have consequences." Without another word, she turned, walked back toward the sidewalk, and made a quick note on her clipboard before leaving. I watched her disappear around the corner, feeling less angry than puzzled. Then I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Across the street, 2 neighbors had quietly stopped what they were doing and were watching my house. One looked away the second our eyes met. The other simply folded his arms and continued standing beside his mailbox. It suddenly felt like everyone knew something I didn't, and for the first time since moving into that neighborhood, walking through my own front door no longer felt like coming home. The next morning, I walked outside with a cup of coffee, expecting the strange conversation from the day before to fade into the background. But instead, I found another envelope tucked neatly beneath my welcome mat. This one was smaller, printed on white paper, and informed me that because I had failed to acknowledge the previous notice, additional administrative fees could soon be added to my account. Less than 24 hours had passed, and somehow I was already being treated like someone refusing to cooperate. I folded the paper and slipped it into my pocket before looking around the neighborhood. Everything appeared perfectly normal. Sprinklers clicked across green lawns. A father helped his daughter ride a bicycle down the sidewalk. Someone was washing a black sport utility vehicle 2 houses away. Yet I could not shake the feeling that something had changed. As I walked to my mailbox, I noticed Linda Brooks standing across the street speaking with another board member. The conversation stopped the moment she saw me. She offered a brief nod, wrote something on the clipboard she carried almost everywhere, and continued talking in a lower voice. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it was not. Later that afternoon, I decided to call the management office listed on the notice. After spending nearly 15 minutes listening to recorded messages, I finally reached a receptionist. I politely asked for copies of the violation reports connected to my address. She placed me on hold before returning with an answer that made even less sense than the letter. According to their records, only the board president could authorize the release of supporting documents while an enforcement process remained active. I asked how I was supposed to respond to accusations I was not allowed to see. She apologized, repeated the policy, and wished me a pleasant day. That evening I mowed the lawn again, even though it barely needed it. I edged the sidewalk, picked up a few stray leaves, and even wiped down my mailbox just in case I had overlooked something obvious. As I worked, I noticed a white sedan slowly driving through the neighborhood. It paused for several seconds in front of my house before continuing down the street. A few minutes later, it passed again. The driver never got out, but I could clearly see someone holding a phone near the window. I told myself not to jump to conclusions, yet the timing felt impossible to ignore. The following morning, another notice appeared, this time warning that continued non-compliance could result in additional action by the association. There was still no photograph, no date, and no description explaining what rule I had supposedly broken. Only another deadline. I decided I was done waiting for answers to arrive in envelopes. I walked across the neighborhood to the management office during business hours, hoping that speaking face-to-face would clear everything up. Instead, the receptionist politely informed me that Linda had already reviewed my file earlier that morning and was unavailable for the rest of the day. As I turned to leave, I noticed a bulletin board displaying community announcements. Mixed between picnic flyers and landscaping reminders was a printed notice about preserving neighborhood standards. Someone had circled one sentence with a red marker that read, "We all share responsibility for protecting property values." I could not explain why, but it felt less like a reminder and more like a message directed specifically at me. Walking back toward my truck, I caught two neighbors glancing in my direction before quietly lowering their voices. And for the first time, I realized the fine itself was no longer the biggest problem. Whatever story was spreading through the neighborhood, I was the only person who had not heard it. By the end of the week, the neighborhood felt different in ways that were impossible to measure, but impossible to ignore. Nobody confronted me directly. Nobody accused me of anything. Instead, conversations seemed to pause whenever I walked by, and friendly waves became hesitant nods. It was subtle enough that I could have convinced myself I was imagining it if the reminders from the association had not continued arriving with almost perfect timing. Every morning, there was something new waiting for me. One notice mentioned unresolved compliance concerns. Another reminded me of possible financial penalties. A third encouraged homeowners to cooperate with the board before enforcement measures became necessary. None of them identified a single specific violation. They all sounded official without actually explaining anything. I refused to let frustration get the better of me. Every evening after work, I walked around my property with my phone, taking photographs of every angle of the house, the lawn, the driveway, the mailbox, and even the landscaping along the sidewalk. If someone was documenting my home, I decided I would document it too. I saved every picture with the date and time. It felt excessive, but at least I would know exactly how everything looked each day. Saturday morning usually meant neighbors working in their yards, and that routine continued as always. I trimmed a few small bushes while families walked their dogs and children rode bicycles along the sidewalk. Across the street, Mrs. Harper smiled politely before walking over. She had lived there longer than almost anyone else and had always treated everyone kindly. She hesitated for a moment before quietly asking, "Is everything all right?" I smiled back and admitted that I honestly did not know. I explained that I kept receiving notices, but nobody would tell me what I had supposedly done wrong. Her expression changed immediately. "That is strange," she said. "I heard people saying your property had repeated problems, but every time I walk by it looks exactly the same." Before I could answer, a familiar voice interrupted us. Linda Brooks approached from the opposite sidewalk, carrying her clipboard once again. "Good morning," she said with a controlled smile. "I hope we are not discussing confidential association matters." Mrs. Harper looked surprised. "We were just talking as neighbors," she replied. Linda nodded politely, but her attention remained fixed on me. "Mr. Carter, I strongly recommend focusing on resolving your account instead of creating unnecessary confusion in the community." I took a slow breath before answering. "I have been asking for one clear explanation since this started." "The board has already communicated everything that needs to be communicated," Linda replied. Then tell me one violation, I said calmly. She paused for just a second before answering. The documentation speaks for itself. I have never seen the documentation. She offered the same practiced smile she always used whenever she wanted a conversation to end. Good day. She walked away without another word, leaving an uncomfortable silence behind. Mrs. Harper watched her disappear before turning back toward me. That was unusual, she admitted. I have never seen anyone refuse such a simple question. I thanked her for stopping by, but the conversation stayed with me long after she returned home. Later that afternoon, I checked my mailbox again. There was no new fine this time. Instead, there was an invitation to attend the next monthly HOA board meeting. At the bottom of the page, one sentence had been printed in bold letters. Homeowners may speak during the public comment period after board business has concluded. It was the first opportunity anyone had given me to say anything at all, and something told me that meeting was going to determine whether the rumors quietly spreading through the neighborhood would finally stop or become impossible to escape. The board meeting took place the following Tuesday evening inside the neighborhood clubhouse, a building I had only visited once before for a holiday gathering. This time the atmosphere felt completely different. Folding chairs had been arranged in neat rows facing a long table where the board members sat with matching binders and bottled water. Nearly 30 homeowners had shown up, far more than I expected for an ordinary meeting. Some smiled politely when I walked in, while others simply watched without saying a word. I took a seat near the back and quietly listened as the board discussed landscaping contracts, pool maintenance, and next year's budget. Every topic moved along quickly until Linda Brooks reminded everyone that homeowner comments would begin after official business concluded. It felt as though she deliberately looked in my direction when she said it. Almost an hour later, she finally announced that residents could speak. I stood up immediately. My name is Ethan Carter, I began. I have received multiple notices demanding more than $1,000 in fines, but I still have not been told what specific rule I violated. I have requested documentation several times and have not received it. I am simply asking for one clear explanation. The room became unusually quiet. Linda folded her hands together before answering. Mr. Carter, enforcement matters are handled according to established procedures. I nodded. Then please tell everyone here which procedure explains the violation. She glanced briefly at another board member before replying. The board has sufficient documentation supporting its decision. Can I see that documentation? I asked. Not during this meeting. Can anyone tell me what the violation actually is? Another moment of silence followed. Several homeowners exchanged confused looks. Finally, one board member cleared his throat but did not answer. Linda stepped in again. This meeting is not intended to debate individual enforcement actions. Before I could respond, a voice came from the middle row. It was Mrs. Harper. I have walked past Ethan's house nearly every day, she said calmly. I have honestly wondered the same thing. Everything always looks well maintained. A few more heads turned toward the board. Then another homeowner, Daniel Foster, slowly raised his hand. I live 2 houses down, he said. I have not noticed any obvious problem either. Linda thanked them for their comments, but immediately tried moving to the next speaker. The tension inside the room shifted almost instantly. People who had arrived expecting a routine meeting were now paying close attention. As the discussion continued, nobody seemed interested in landscaping anymore. Instead, neighbors quietly whispered among themselves while looking back and forth between me and the board table. When the meeting finally ended, several residents approached me in the parking lot. Most admitted they had assumed I must have ignored repeated warnings because that was the impression circulating through the neighborhood. After hearing the discussion, they were no longer sure what to believe. While we were talking, Daniel hesitated before saying something that caught my attention. I probably should have mentioned this earlier, he said. My doorbell camera points toward part of the street. Last week it recorded Linda stopping near your mailbox before sunrise. I never thought much about it until tonight. My heart skipped for a moment. Does the camera record automatically? I asked. He nodded. Everything that moves. I tried to remain calm even though dozens of questions immediately rushed through my mind. Would you mind checking the recording? Daniel looked back toward his house before answering. I will. If it is still saved, we can watch it together tomorrow evening. As everyone slowly left the parking lot, I realized this was the first time since the notices began that something had changed in my favor. For days I had been asking for answers that never came. Now, without anyone planning it, The neighborhood itself had started looking for them. The following evening, I walked over to Daniel Foster's house, carrying nothing except my phone and a notebook where I had been keeping every date connected to the notices. Daniel greeted me at the door with an expression that suggested he had already found something worth showing. We sat at his kitchen table while he opened the recordings stored by his doorbell camera. Most of the clips showed ordinary neighborhood activity. Delivery drivers, families walking dogs, children riding bicycles, and the occasional car passing through the subdivision. Then he stopped on a video recorded just before sunrise 3 days before I had discovered the yellow envelope. The camera angle did not point directly at my front door, but it clearly captured part of the sidewalk, my mailbox, and the edge of my driveway. A familiar figure entered the frame carrying a clipboard. It was Linda Brooks. She paused beside my mailbox, looked toward my house for several seconds, wrote something on her clipboard, and then continued walking. Nothing about the recording proved that she had done anything improper, but one detail immediately stood out. The timestamp showed she had documented my property before I had supposedly failed to respond to any notice. According to the letters I had received, the enforcement process had already advanced to repeated violations before I even knew a problem existed. Daniel replayed the clip twice before looking at me. "I thought you should see that," he said quietly. "Maybe there is an innocent explanation, but the timeline seems strange." I agreed. I thanked him for taking the time to check his recordings and asked if he would be comfortable saving a copy in case it was ever needed later. He nodded without hesitation. I would rather have it than wonder why I deleted it. As I walked home, I realized the video alone would not solve anything, but it raised a question nobody from the board had answered. Why had the process moved so quickly without giving me an opportunity to correct whatever they claimed was wrong? The next morning, I opened my mailbox expecting another notice. Instead, I found a letter announcing that my account would soon be reviewed for additional compliance measures because the previous balance remained unpaid. The wording sounded more serious than before, but it still avoided describing the actual violation. I immediately added the letter to the growing folder I had organized on my dining room table. Every notice, every photograph of my property, every email, and every handwritten note now sat in chronological order. Later that afternoon, my phone rang. The caller was Mrs. Harper. She sounded hesitant at first, but then explained that after the board meeting, several longtime residents had started comparing experiences. She told me that 2 neighbors remembered receiving warning letters years earlier that were quickly corrected after simple conversations with previous board members. They were surprised that no one seemed willing to explain my situation. "People are beginning to ask questions," she said. "Not because they think you are right automatically, but because they cannot understand why nobody will answer a simple one." That conversation encouraged me more than I expected. For the first time since this began, the discussion was no longer just between me and Linda. The neighborhood itself had started paying attention. That evening, while organizing the newest letter into my folder, I noticed something else. Every notice had been signed using the same printed authorization line, but none of them contained an individual signature. They looked official, yet strangely impersonal, almost as if they had been generated without anyone wanting to accept responsibility for the decision. I leaned back in my chair, looking across the neatly arranged stack of papers, and realized the story had quietly shifted. I was no longer trying to prove that I had done nothing wrong. I was trying to understand why the people making accusations seemed determined to avoid answering the most basic question anyone could ask. 2 days later, the situation took another unexpected turn. Early Saturday morning, I heard a knock at my front door. When I opened it, I found Linda Brooks standing on my porch with 2 other board members carrying folders and clipboards. None of them smiled this time. Linda spoke in the same calm, carefully measured voice she always used. "Mr. Carter, we are conducting a compliance follow-up regarding your unresolved enforcement matter." I stepped outside and quietly closed the door behind me. "I am still waiting for someone to explain what rule I violated," I replied. Linda ignored the question. Instead, she looked toward one of the board members, who began taking notes while another slowly looked across my front yard. The entire visit felt less like a conversation and more like an inspection. I remained polite and answered every question directly, but every time I asked for clarification, the response stayed the same. "The board has already documented its findings." After several minutes, Linda informed me that because I continued refusing to resolve the matter, the board would be recording another compliance report. I asked whether I could receive a copy before any additional action was taken. She simply said that the appropriate documents would be delivered through official channels. As they turned to leave, I noticed several neighbors quietly watching from their driveways. Nobody interrupted, but it was obvious the entire street had become interested in what was happening. Less than an hour later, Daniel Foster called me. "You might want to come outside," he said. When I reached the sidewalk, Daniel pointed toward the opposite side of the street where Mrs. Harper and two other homeowners were talking together. They waved me over. Mrs. Harper explained that several residents had become concerned after seeing another inspection at my house, without any explanation being shared with the community. One neighbor admitted that rumors had grown so confusing that nobody knew what was actually true anymore. Another resident said he had reviewed previous neighborhood newsletters and could not find any announcement describing the type of violation I had supposedly committed. The conversation remained calm, but it was clear that uncertainty was spreading much faster than facts. While we were talking, Linda unexpectedly returned in her vehicle and stopped along the curb. She stepped out carrying another envelope. Without raising her voice, she handed it to me and said, "This is your final opportunity to resolve the matter voluntarily." I opened the envelope immediately. The amount listed had increased again because of additional administrative charges. I looked up and calmly asked, "Will someone finally explain the original violation today?" Linda replied, "The documentation is complete." Before she could continue, Daniel respectfully asked, "If the documentation is complete, why can nobody see it?" Mrs. Harper quietly added, "Several of us have asked the same question." For the first time since this began, Linda appeared uncomfortable. She thanked everyone for their interest, but reminded us that enforcement matters were confidential. The discussion might have ended there, but another unexpected event changed everything. A passing delivery driver slowed down after noticing several people gathered near the sidewalk and briefly stopped to make sure no emergency had occurred. Seeing the growing crowd, another neighbor suggested that the conversation should not continue in the middle of the street because misunderstandings were only becoming worse. Someone recommended contacting the local non-emergency police line so an officer could simply help keep the discussion orderly if tensions continued rising. No one was accusing anyone of a crime. The goal was only to prevent the situation from becoming more confusing as more residents gathered. Within minutes, word spread that an officer had been requested to stop by if available. Linda looked around at the increasingly curious neighbors before returning quietly to her vehicle. As she drove away, I realized the situation had moved beyond private letters and closed board meetings. The entire neighborhood had now witnessed the unanswered questions firsthand, and before the day was over, someone completely outside the homeowners association would be listening to both sides of the story. About 20 minutes later, a marked police vehicle slowly entered the neighborhood and stopped along the curb in front of my house. The officer stepped out with a calm expression, greeted everyone politely, and immediately made it clear that he was there only to keep the conversation peaceful and understand why so many residents had gathered. His relaxed approach changed the atmosphere almost instantly. People lowered their voices, and instead of talking over one another, everyone waited their turn. The officer first asked whether there had been any threats, property damage, or immediate safety concerns. Every person present answered no. He nodded and explained that disagreements involving neighborhood associations were generally civil matters. But since several residents had requested assistance in preventing the discussion from becoming disruptive, he was happy to make sure everyone had an opportunity to speak respectfully. Linda Brooks returned only a few minutes later after apparently learning that an officer had arrived. She walked over carrying the same clipboard and folder she always seemed to have with her. After introducing herself as the president of the Homeowners Association, she explained that the board had been enforcing community standards according to established procedures. The officer listened carefully before asking a simple question. "Has the homeowner been informed of the specific violation?" Linda answered that the association had provided multiple official notices. I quietly held up the folder I had been carrying and said, "I have every notice right here." The officer asked if he could look through them. Standing beside his vehicle, he carefully reviewed each page one at a time. After several minutes, he looked up and asked, "These letters mention enforcement and payment deadlines, but I do not see a description of the original issue. Is there another document that explains it?" Linda replied that the supporting documentation was maintained in the association records. Has he received a copy? The officer asked. Linda paused before saying that board procedures controlled the release of internal records. The officer remained completely neutral. I am not making decisions about your association, he said. I am simply trying to understand why there appears to be confusion. By then, more neighbors had quietly gathered nearby. Daniel Foster stepped forward and explained that he had reviewed his doorbell camera after the recent board meeting. He offered to show the recording if the officer wished to understand the timeline being discussed. The officer agreed to watch it. Daniel opened the video on his phone, and several of us stood nearby while the recording played. The clip showed Linda walking past my property before sunrise, stopping to write notes near my mailbox days before I had ever received the first notice. When the video ended, the officer handed the phone back without making any conclusions. Instead, he simply asked another question. When was the homeowner first notified that there was a problem? Nobody answered immediately. Mrs. Harper quietly spoke up from behind the group. That is exactly what many of us have been asking. Another neighbor added that the board meeting had ended without anyone explaining the violation despite repeated requests. The officer looked from one person to another before addressing everyone together. It sounds like there may be a communication issue that has grown larger because people are working from different information. His words were calm, but they carried weight because they came from someone who had no personal interest in the disagreement. Before leaving, he suggested that all future communication be documented in writing and encouraged both sides to exchange complete information instead of assumptions. He also noted the date and time of his response in case anyone later needed confirmation that he had been called only to keep the peace. As he returned to his patrol vehicle, something subtle but important changed. For the first time since this situation began, the unanswered questions had been heard by someone completely outside the neighborhood, and judging by the thoughtful expressions on my neighbors' faces, many of them had begun reaching the same conclusion that I had. The problem was no longer the fine itself. The problem was that nobody seemed willing to explain how it had ever been justified in the first place. The neighborhood was noticeably quieter after the police officer left, but the silence did not last long. By Sunday afternoon, several homeowners had begun comparing the notices they had received over the years, and what started as casual conversations quickly turned into careful observations. Daniel Foster stopped by my house, carrying a small folder. I found something else, he said. Inside were printed screenshots from his doorbell camera showing the dates and times of several recordings. He pointed to the clip we had already watched and then to another recording captured later that same morning. In the second video, a neighborhood management vehicle briefly entered the subdivision before turning around and leaving without stopping anywhere else. The sequence itself did not prove wrongdoing, but it reinforced the timeline. The documentation process had clearly started before I ever knew there was an issue. Later that day, Mrs. Harper called to tell me that another longtime resident had searched through old community newsletters saved in a filing cabinet. Those newsletters described how homeowners were normally notified about maintenance concerns. According to the printed guidance, residents were expected to receive an initial courtesy notice before fines could move forward except under limited circumstances. I quietly compared that information with the stack of papers spread across my dining room table. There was no courtesy notice anywhere in my file. There was only a demand for payment followed by increasing penalties. Monday morning, I sent a respectful written request to the management office asking for copies of every document connected to my address, including the original inspection record and the date the first notice had supposedly been issued. Instead of making accusations, I simply asked that the complete file be provided so the timeline could be verified. Late that afternoon, I finally received a reply by electronic mail. The message stated that the association would review my request and gather the available records. It was the first time anyone had acknowledged my request without immediately referring me back to the board president. 2 days later, another email arrived inviting me to meet with the property manager and 2 board members at the management office. When I entered the conference room, the atmosphere felt very different from every previous conversation. The property manager placed a folder on the table and calmly explained that several records had been reviewed after my written request. As the documents were organized by date, one detail immediately stood out. The inspection log referenced an earlier courtesy notification, yet no copy of that notification could be located in the file. The manager looked at the board members before quietly saying that the record appeared incomplete. Linda Brooks remained composed, explaining that older documents were sometimes misplaced during administrative transitions. Nobody argued with her, but nobody interrupted the manager either. He continued turning pages until he reached the inspection dates. The timeline showed that administrative fees had been added unusually quickly after the initial entry. Once again, there was no clear explanation describing the specific condition that had supposedly violated community standards. The manager leaned back in his chair and admitted that without complete supporting documentation, it would be difficult to verify whether the enforcement process had followed the association's own published procedures. Hearing those words felt completely different from hearing neighbors express sympathy. This was someone reviewing the official records themselves. Linda no longer spoke with the same certainty she had displayed for weeks. Instead, she suggested that additional time might be needed to clarify the file. I simply thanked everyone for reviewing the documents and said I wanted only one thing from the beginning: a fair explanation supported by complete records. As I left the office, the property manager stopped me near the door and quietly said that the board would likely need to discuss the matter again before taking any further action. Walking back to my truck, I realized the balance of the entire situation had finally shifted. For weeks I had been defending myself against claims that nobody would explain. Now the discussion had changed completely. Instead of asking me to justify my actions, the association itself was being asked to justify its own process. 1 week later, the association scheduled a special board meeting, and this time the room was even more crowded than before. Homeowners who had never attended a meeting arrived early, quietly filling nearly every chair. The atmosphere was respectful, but everyone could feel that something important was about to happen. I took the same seat near the back where I had sat during the previous meeting, carrying the same folder that now contained every notice, every photograph, every electronic mail, and every handwritten note I had collected since the first envelope appeared on my front door. When the meeting began, the property manager spoke before anyone else. He explained that after reviewing the available records, the association had identified gaps in the documentation related to my enforcement file. He carefully avoided assigning blame, but his conclusion was clear. The file did not contain enough supporting material to confirm that the published notification process had been completed before penalties were assessed. The room remained completely silent. Linda Brooks listened without interrupting. When the manager finished, he recommended that the outstanding fines connected to my address be withdrawn while the board reviewed its internal procedures to prevent similar situations in the future. Several board members quietly nodded in agreement. Linda finally stood and addressed the room. Her voice remained calm, although noticeably less confident than it had been during every previous encounter. She acknowledged that the documentation process had not met the standards expected by the association and stated that the board would accept the manager's recommendation. With that single statement, the penalties that had followed me for weeks were officially removed. I did not celebrate or argue. I simply thanked the board for reviewing the matter and said that all I had ever wanted was a fair opportunity to understand the accusation before being asked to pay for it. As the meeting continued, several homeowners requested that future enforcement procedures become more transparent. Mrs. Harper thanked the board for taking another look at the records instead of allowing questions to remain unanswered. Daniel Foster suggested that homeowners receive clear written explanations before financial penalties were considered. One by one, residents who had remained quiet at earlier meetings began sharing thoughtful ideas about improving communication throughout the neighborhood. What surprised me most was how quickly the mood changed once everyone felt they were working toward the same goal instead of defending opposing positions. During the following weeks, life slowly returned to normal. The envelopes stopped appearing at my door. The rumors disappeared because there was no longer any mystery to discuss. Neighbors once again waved while walking their dogs. Children rode bicycles through the subdivision, and weekend conversations returned to gardening, football, and vacation plans instead of association meetings. One Saturday morning, I was trimming the edge of my lawn when Daniel walked over holding a cup of coffee. He smiled and said, "I guess sometimes one question is powerful enough to change an entire conversation." I laughed because he was right. None of this had started with a dramatic confrontation. It had started with a simple request for an explanation. Looking back, I realized the most important lesson had nothing to do with fines, paperwork, or board meetings. Communities work best when people trust one another, and trust grows from openness, consistency, and the willingness to answer reasonable questions with honest information instead of assumptions. Months later, the association distributed updated homeowner guidelines explaining the notification process in much greater detail than before. Whether those changes happened because of my situation or because many neighbors had spoken up together no longer mattered. What mattered was that the neighborhood felt like a community again instead of a place where unanswered questions quietly divided people. Every time I walked past my mailbox after that, I remembered the yellow envelope that had started everything. But I also remembered something much more important. Staying calm, keeping careful records, and treating people respectfully had accomplished far more than frustration ever could. And in the end, the truth did not arrive because someone argued the loudest. It arrived because enough ordinary people cared enough to ask for clear answers and refused to stop asking until those answers finally appeared.